Heard another trucker's voice in hours. This didn't make any sense. Help. For the love of God, the voice repeated, more desperate now. He hesitated, but then picked up the radio. This is Big Red, what's your emergency? There was a pause, just static, until the voice returned. They're coming for me. I'm at mile marker 207. Please, don't stop, on stop, if you stop. The signal died, leaving only a high-pitched whine. Dave glanced at the road ahead. He was approaching mile marker 207. His pulse quickened. Most truckers had their share of odd encounters on the road. Strange hitchhikers, unexplained lights, phantom figures at the edge of the highway. But this felt different. This felt like a warning. He thought of ignoring it, pushing through until he hit the next town. But something gnawed at him. What if someone really was in trouble? As he neared the marker, his headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a truck off the road and skewed into the trees. The hazard lights blinked weakly, casting an eerie orange glow across the underbrush. It was an older rig, its trailer tilted at a dangerous angle, as if it had been abandoned mid-crash. Dave slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. His instincts screamed to keep driving, but the code of the road was strong. You didn't leave a fellow trucker stranded. He grabbed his flashlight, slid out of the cab, and felt the chill of the night wrap around him. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Even the insects seemed to have gone still. "Hey," Dave called out, making his way toward the wreck. "Anyone here? You good?" No response. The door to the truck was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. The glass on the window was smashed inward, and dark streaks, blood, ran down the side of the cab. Dave's heart raced as he shone his flashlight inside. The cab was empty, but it looked like there had been a struggle. Papers were strewn everywhere, and the seat was torn. More of that dark substance, definitely blood, was smeared across the dashboard. He heard a rustle behind him. Spinning around, he aimed the beam of his light into the trees. For a moment, he thought he saw something, someone moving between the trunks. The figure was too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways. "Hello?" he called again, his voice shaky now. The figure stopped, just at the edge of the light. Dave's breath hitched. It wasn't a person, not entirely. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across a gaunt frame, and its eyes. Those eyes were glowing, reflecting the light like an animal caught in headlights. Suddenly, the CB radio in his truck crackled to life again. That same distorted voice screamed, "Run! Get out of there!" Dave didn't need to be told twice. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure that seemed to be watching him, almost studying him. Then, as if it had lost interest, the thing turned and disappeared into the woods, moving in long, deliberate strides. He bolted for his rig, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. Slamming the door shut behind him, Dave fumbled to get the truck back in gear. He didn't look back. The tires screeched as they gripped the asphalt, propelling him away from mile marker 207. The radio crackled again. "It's too late for me, but don't stop. Don't ever stop." The voice faded into static. For hours, Dave drove in a daze, his mind replaying the scene over and over. Who or what had that been? What had happened to the driver of that wrecked rig? And why had it warned him to never stop? He finally reached the next town at dawn, pulling into a truck stop, shaking and pale. He told the manager what he had seen, and they called the local sheriff. A few hours later, the sheriff returned, grim-faced. "There's no wreck at mile marker 207, he said. "We checked the area thoroughly." "But I saw it," Dave protested. "I saw the truck, the blood." The sheriff sighed. "Son, that stretch of road has a history. 20 years ago, a trucker crashed at mile marker 207. Never found his body, though. Just his rig. People say they hear his voice sometimes, warning them, telling them not to stop. But those who do..." The sheriff trailed off, giving Dave a knowing look. Dave didn't argue. He knew what he had seen. And from that day on, he swore he would never drive that route again. He'd also learned a valuable lesson. In the dark, lonely hours of the night, when you're on the road and your gut tells you something's wrong, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, it's not just your imagination. Sometimes, it's the thing lurking in the shadows. Dave sat in the truck stop diner long after the sheriff had left, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. His hands trembled slightly, and he couldn't shake the image of those eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring right through him like they knew something about him, something he didn't even know about himself. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlpool of fear in his stomach. The waitress, a kindly middle-aged woman, noticed his pallor and walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. "You all right, hun?" she asked, her voice a soft drawl. "Yeah," Dave lied, pushing his cup forward for a refill. "Just. Long night. Lot of truckers pass through here with that same look," she said, pouring the coffee slowly. "You see something strange out there on the highway?" Dave paused, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "You get many stories like that?" The waitress leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice. "Oh, we get all kinds. I've been working here 20 years, and let me tell you, there's things out there on the roads that ain't natural. Some folks say they've seen spirits, others talk about strange creatures, even whole cars disappearing into thin air. But the worst ones always seem to happen around mile marker 207. Dave felt a chill run down his spine. "You know about 207? She nodded gravely. "That place is cursed, ever since that trucker went missing. What was his name? Jim Holloway, I think. Poor guy. They found his truck just like you said, but he was gone. Not a trace. Some say he's still out there, wandering the woods, looking for a way home." "Heard the same thing," Dave muttered, gripping his coffee cup tighter. "But what I saw wasn't just a ghost. There was something else. Something in the woods." The waitress frowned and glanced out the diner window, as if expecting to see the trees looming nearby. "There's been rumors of that too. Some folks talk about a creature, a thing that ain't human but can mimic us. It's drawn to accidents, especially ones where blood's been spilled. I don't know if I believe it all, but too many truckers have come through here with stories like yours." Dave didn't respond. He stared into his coffee, trying to convince himself that it was just exhaustion, maybe a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But deep down, he knew better. He had felt the malice in the air that night, a malevolent presence watching him from the darkness. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that it wasn't just the trucker's ghost warning him, it was something else, something far more dangerous. The door to the diner jingled as a pair of truckers walked in, chatting loudly, their heavy boots clomping on the tile floor. They took seats at the counter, oblivious to the dark conversation happening just a few feet away. Dave drained his coffee and stood up, throwing a few crumpled bills on the table. "Thanks for the refill," he muttered. The waitress nodded, giving him a knowing look. "You take care out there, Honorable, and remember, if you're ever near mile marker 207 again, don't stop for anything." For weeks, Dave avoided any routes that would take him near the cursed stretch of highway. His dispatcher, Charlie, asked him more than once why he was being so picky with his assignments, but Dave never gave a straight answer. He just couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for him, watching. It wasn't until one late October night, just before Halloween, that Dave's worst fears were realized. He was hauling a shipment of electronics to a warehouse in the Pacific Northwest, a long run that would take him through several states. He had planned his route carefully, avoiding mile marker 207 like the plague. But somewhere around midnight, while driving through the mountains, he ran into trouble. A heavy fog rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He slowed the rig down, squinting through the windshield, trying to see the road ahead. The fog was so thick it was like driving through a cloud, the beams of his headlights swallowed by the gray. The only sound was the steady hum of his engine and the occasional creak of the trailer behind him. Then through the mist he saw it, a faint glimmer of red lights. Hazard lights. His heart leapt into his throat. It couldn't be. Dave checked his GPS, but the fog was interfering with the signal. The screen showed nothing but a blank map. He glanced at the road signs. None. Just empty highway, swallowed by the mist. But he knew, deep in his gut, that he had been diverted somehow. He had ended up back near mile marker 207. The hazard lights blinked slowly in the distance, growing closer and closer until he could make out the shape of the truck. It was the same rig he had seen weeks ago, still skewed off the road, tilted dangerously into the trees. No, 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 Dave muttered to himself, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. The CB radio crackled to life. Don't stop, Dave, for God's sake, don't stop. It was the same voice, distorted and filled with panic. He pressed down harder on the accelerator, trying to push through the fog, but his truck wouldn't respond. The engine sputtered and whined, as if it were being choked by some unseen force. Then, from the corner of his eye, Dave saw movement. At the edge of the fog, just barely visible in his peripheral vision, something was walking toward him. Long, gangly limbs, pale skin stretched thin over bones, and those same glowing eyes. It was back, and this time it wasn't letting him go. The creature moved closer, its long fingers stretching out toward his truck as if it could reach right through the metal. Dave's heart raced as he frantically tried to restart the engine, but the rig refused to cooperate. The creature's face came into view, pale and hollow-eyed, with a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with rows of sharp teeth. Suddenly the CB blared again, louder this time. "Run, Dave, go now!" With a final desperate twist of the key, the engine roared to life. Dave didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, sending the rig hurtling down the highway, leaving the fog and the creature behind. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, far away from mile marker 207. To this day, Dave doesn't talk about what happened that night. He avoids the route at all costs and has since retired from long-haul trucking. But every now and then, late at night when the fog rolls in, he hears the faint crackle of the CB radio and the voice of a trucker warning him, "Don't stop. Not for anything." And he knows that whatever he encountered that night is still out there, waiting for the next trucker who makes the mistake of stopping at mile marker 207. For weeks, Dave lived in a constant state of dread. The encounter at mile marker 207 haunted him. It was no longer just a story shared over cups of bad coffee at truck stops or whispers exchanged between truckers over the CB radio. For him, it had become horrifyingly real. Every time he drove, his mind would wander back to that night, the glowing eyes, the distorted voice on the radio, and the creature's outstretched arms reaching for him from the fog. He'd wake up at odd hours of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, as if he could still hear the faint crackle of the CB calling out to him in desperation. "Don't stop, Dave." Charlie, his dispatcher, noticed the change too. Dave was becoming jittery, avoiding certain routes and turning down well-paying runs. Normally a reliable trucker, Dave had grown erratic, pushing back on assignments and making excuses. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever, but every time the idea of getting back on the road came up, that gnawing sense of dread crept back in. One morning, after weeks of laying low, Charlie called him into the office. "Dave, we need to talk," Charlie said, his voice firm but concerned. Dave sat in the small office, glancing at the framed maps on the wall, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. "Yeah, I figured." "What's going on, man? You've been dodging routes, taking days off. You've never been like this. Is something wrong?" Dave opened his mouth to explain but hesitated. How could he even begin to describe what had happened without sounding completely insane? I've just been feeling off, Charlie. That's all," Dave muttered, his eyes darting away. Charlie frowned. "Come on, Dave. We've known each other too long for this. Talk to me." Dave sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "It's that stretch near mile marker 207. Ever since I took that route, I've been seeing things, hearing things. I don't know what it was, but something's out there, Charlie. Something dangerous." Charlie leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Mile marker 207, huh?" His face tightened as if he knew something but was reluctant to say it. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Dave pressed, sensing his dispatcher's hesitation. "I've heard 'em. Every trucker's got a tale about that place," Charlie said slowly. "But most guys chalk it up to bad weather or exhaustion. You know how the mind plays tricks on you when you're out there on the road too long." "It wasn't exhaustion, Charlie," Dave said, his voice firm. "This was real. The truck, the thing in the woods, I saw it." For a moment, Charlie didn't say anything. He glanced out the window at the line of trucks parked in the lot. "You're not the first driver to talk about mile marker 207 like that. A few years back we had a guy, Mark Winters. He took a run through that area. Afterward, he quit trucking for good." said he saw something he couldn't explain. But when we asked him to tell us what happened, well, he just wouldn't. He said it was better that way. Dave's heart skipped a beat. What happened to him? Last I heard, he moved out west. Lives off the grid now. Doesn't talk to anyone. Guess whatever he saw scared him enough to make him leave the business altogether. The room fell silent as the weight of Charlie's words settled in. So what now? Dave asked, his voice hollow. I can't just avoid that route forever. Charlie shook his head slowly. Look, I don't have all the answers, Dave. But if this thing is real, maybe it's best to stay away. I don't want you ending up like Mark. Dave nodded, though deep down he knew avoiding mile marker 207 wasn't enough. Something about that night had changed him. Even when he wasn't near the cursed stretch of road, he felt its presence lurking at the back of his mind. It was as if whatever was out there had marked him, like it wasn't done with him yet. A few weeks later, the call came in. It was a routine job, at least on paper. A late-night delivery to a warehouse just outside of Spokane, Washington. The pay was good, and the route was straightforward. But the moment Dave looked at the map, his stomach twisted. The fastest route took him right past mile marker 207. He stared at the map for a long time, debating whether to take it or not. He could refuse, find an excuse, tell Charlie he wasn't ready. But part of him knew he couldn't keep running. Whatever had happened that night had left a mark on him, and if he didn't face it now, it would follow him forever. So, reluctantly, Dave accepted the job. As he climbed into his rig later that night, the familiar hum of the engine filled the cab. The weight of the road ahead pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, but he set his jaw and gripped the wheel tightly. He had to know, was it all in his head or was there truly something out there, waiting for him in the darkness? The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The hum of the tires on the asphalt, the occasional blip on the CB, and the glow of the dashboard kept him company as the highway stretched out before him. But as the night wore on and the miles rolled by, the tension in his chest grew tighter. The closer he got to mile marker 207, the heavier the air became. The trees along the highway seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the mist that had started to rise from the ground. And then, in the distance, he saw it. The faint red glow of hazard lights. Dave's breath caught in his throat. There it was again, the wrecked truck, just like before, skewed off the road at an unnatural angle. The hazard lights blinked slowly, casting an eerie orange glow over the surrounding forest. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he slowed the rig. Every instinct screamed at him to keep going, to push through, but something compelled him to stop. He had to know. He had to confront whatever was waiting for him. He pulled onto the shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest, and switched off the engine. The night was deathly quiet, save for the soft ticking of the cooling engine and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Stepping out of the cab, Dave grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick fog that had gathered around him. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the wrecked truck, his pulse quickening with each step. The door of the truck was ajar, just like before. The glass on the window was shattered, and dark streaks of blood smeared the dashboard. "Hello?" Dave called out, his voice trembling in the stillness. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of the woods. Suddenly, the CB in his truck crackled to life. That same distorted voice echoed through the night, louder this time, more urgent. "Dave, get out, now." Before he could react, a low growl came from the darkness behind him. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the trees, but the fog was too thick to see anything clearly. Then, from the shadows, the figure emerged, tall, gaunt, and inhuman, its eyes glowing with that same eerie light. Its limbs were impossibly long, and its mouth stretched wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Dave's heart raced as he stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch and landing hard on the ground. The creature advanced slowly, its long arms reaching out toward him. He scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming in panic. He had to get back to the truck. He had to get out of here. Just as the creature was about to reach him, the voice on the CB blared again. "Run!" With a final burst of adrenaline, Dave sprinted back to his rig, slamming the door shut just as the creature lunged at him. His hands shook as he fumbled to start the engine, but the rig roared to life, and he floored the gas, leaving the wrecked truck, and whatever nightmare lurked there, behind him. As the fog cleared and the miles stretched out ahead, Dave glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The creature was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Dave drove for hours, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He could barely breathe, his chest tight with fear as he tried to shake off the image of the creature, its glowing eyes, its skeletal limbs, its terrible grinning maw. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless, with only the faint glow of distant city lights to break the monotony of the road. As the rig rumbled down the lonely stretch of asphalt, his mind raced. What was that thing? A spirit? Some kind of demon? He had heard plenty of wild stories from other truckers about ghosts and strange happenings on the road, but nothing had prepared him for this. This was something darker, something far more malevolent. And the worst part? It didn't feel like it was over. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crackle of the CB radio again. The voice returned, not as distorted this time, but clearer. It was calm, but the urgency in the tone sent chills up Dave's spine. "Dave, listen to me. You need to stop." His heart skipped a beat. "What? Who are you?" He barked into the CB, his voice shaking. "What do you mean I need to stop?" The voice hesitated for a moment, and then it came through again, quieter. "It's following you." Dave's blood ran cold. What's following me?" "The thing you saw," the voice said gravely. "It's not bound to mile marker 207. It can move, and now it's attached to you. You drove too close, and it marked you. That's how it works. It latches onto the unlucky ones who pass by at the wrong time." Dave's stomach twisted in terror. "How do you know all this?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then the voice returned, sounding almost sad. "Because it happened to me." Dave's breath caught in his throat. "What? Who are you?" "Jim Holloway," the voice said quietly. The name hit Dave like a punch to the gut. Jim Holloway, the same trucker who had gone missing near mile marker 207 all those years ago. The one who'd been found dead in his rig, or so the stories went. Dave's hands trembled as he grabbed the mic. "But you're supposed to be dead." "I am," Jim's voice replied, barely more than a whisper. "But that thing, it took me just like it's trying to take you. You can't outrun it, Dave. It doesn't matter how far you go. You need to face it." Dave's mind raced. He had heard about truckers disappearing without a trace, about bodies found in rigs with no explanation, but he never thought it could be true. Until now. "What does it want?" Dave asked, his voice cracking with fear. "Why is it doing this?" "It feeds on fear," Jim explained. "It thrives on the terror of those it hunts. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. Not until it's done with you." Dave felt like he was going to be sick. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the empty road behind him. "I can't stop," Dave muttered, more to himself than to Jim. "If I stop, it'll get me." "You can't run forever," Jim replied. "But there's a way, a chance to escape." Dave's heart pounded in his chest. "What do I have to do?" "You need to go back to where it started," Jim said, his voice steady now. "Back to mile marker 207. It has to end there. Face it head on and maybe, just maybe, you can break the connection. Go back." Dave's voice cracked in disbelief. "Are you insane? I barely made it out alive last time." "You don't have a choice," Jim said firmly. "It'll keep coming for you, Dave, no matter how far you run. If you don't go back, it'll drive you mad just like it did to me." A cold, sinking feeling settled in Dave's gut. He didn't want to go back to that cursed place, but Jim was right. He couldn't run forever. The thing was following him. He could feel it, a creeping dread that lurked just outside the edges of his consciousness. If he didn't face it now, he'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for it to strike. With a deep breath, Dave made his decision. He turned the wheel, guiding his rig off the highway and onto the nearest exit. The road was dark, winding through dense forests as he made his way back toward mile marker 207. The drive back was agonizing. Every mile felt like an eternity, the tension in Dave's body growing tighter with each passing second. His headlights cut through the fog, casting eerie shadows across the trees that lined the narrow road. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the CB radio. "Almost there," Jim's voice crackled over the radio again, as if sensing Dave's growing anxiety. "Stay sharp, and don't let it get in your head. That's how it gets you." Dave gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of the marker. His heart raced as he remembered the last time he had driven this road. The hazard lights, the bloodstains, the creature's hollow face. He swallowed hard, pushing the memories aside. He had to stay focused. Finally, up ahead in the distance, he saw it, mile marker 207. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the spot where the wrecked truck had been. But this time, there were no hazard lights. No sign of the wreck at all. The road was empty, shrouded in fog, as if nothing had ever happened there. He pulled the rig to a stop on the shoulder, his hands shaking as he killed the engine. The night was eerily quiet, the fog hanging thick and heavy in the air. "Now what?" Dave whispered into the CB. There was no response, only static. "Jim?" Dave's voice cracked. "What do I do now?" The static continued, rising in intensity until it became a deafening roar, filling the cab with its terrible sound. Dave clamped his hands over his ears, wincing in pain, but the noise only grew louder. And then, suddenly, it stopped. In the silence that followed, Dave felt a presence, an icy coldness that seeped into the cab of the truck, chilling him to the bone. Slowly he turned his head to look out the driver's side window. Standing just outside, bathed in the pale light of the moon, was the creature. Its glowing eyes locked onto his, filled with hunger and malice. It grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Dave's heart slammed against his ribs as he fumbled for the door handle. He had to get out. He had to run. But before he could move, the creature lunged forward, slamming its bony hand against the window. The glass cracked beneath its touch, spider webbing out in all directions. "Dave," the voice on the CB crackled, weak now, barely audible. "Don't let it in." But it was too late. With a final sickening crunch, the glass shattered, and the creature's arm shot into the cab, its long fingers wrapping around Dave's throat. He gasped for air, struggling against its iron grip, but the creature was too strong. His vision blurred, darkness creeping in around the edges as he felt himself slipping away. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the faint crackle of the CB, Jim's voice barely a whisper now. "I'm sorry." When the highway patrol found Dave's truck the next morning, it was parked neatly on the shoulder near mile marker 207. The driver's side window was shattered, and the interior was covered in strange, claw-like marks. But Dave was gone. No blood,